This whole attack the WHO is a massive theme. I do want to hit here. We just flashed up the price of West Texas. We're watching, of course, crude prices just plummet on the New York contract, and it's causing a lot of uncertainty in the world. And I just have to start there with you because we're seeing this historic low on that New York contract. Of course, the out contracts are still higher, but just in terms of the uncertainty that you think is driving that, what is going on in the world today?
Well, there's this little thing called coronavirus that has led us to basically stop both the supply and demand side of the global economy rolling. So started in China, but now across Europe and the United States and hitting the developing world as well. That's kind of everybody. So it turns out that if you shut down both supply and demand, you reduce the need for oil. And it also turns out we don't have unlimited places to store oil. So you put that all together, and it's a massive shock for the price. Combine that with the fact that the Russians and the Saudis don't exactly get on, and indeed the politics of energy in general is very fraught between OPEC, OPEC plus, OPEC plus. The Americans are now the leading producer, but that's more market-driven than it is government-driven, unlike the Saudis, unlike the Russians. So, I mean, really it's a perfect storm for the oil producers out there, and you're seeing that reflect in the prices today.
Yeah, American producers are really getting pummeled, while we are also hearing that China is actually trying to take advantage of cheaper prices and adding to their national stockpiles. Will the
As are the Americans, yes.
Right, as are the Americans and many others. Will the plunge in oil prices, what are the geopolitical ramifications of this?
Well, the real impact, I mean, normally it benefits a lot the countries that are consuming all of this energy because they're getting reduced costs at the pump. But if your economy is stopped and your citizens aren't going anywhere, then they don't benefit as much. So it's not as much of an upside for many folks. It is real downside for the big producers. And at least the Saudis and the Russians have deep pockets and domestic political stability, such as it is. So, I mean, it's not a disaster for them. They can hold on with really low prices for a year or two. That's not the case for countries like Ecuador or Venezuela or Iran or Iraq, for whom a $20 or lower price is going to lead to a lot of social instability and maybe even internal regime implosion. I mean, you have to worry about what that means when we're already facing the worst economic contraction globally since the Great Depression.
And of course, the stability in the price of oil and access to supply has driven an awful lot of foreign policy throughout history, Ian. So how does that shift when it is no longer a factor? That's been something that's been going on, of course, leading to your GZERO sort of theory in part. You know, the U.S. is oil independent. But what regions do we have to fear now, to your point, when there's instability, when there might be regime change, when we do see regions where the whole regional stability is at risk?
Well, I mean, one is a question of the viability of the Eurozone and the European Union when the Germans are governing really well, but there's no Europe. And the Italians and Spaniards and others will need massive bailouts, much greater than what we saw with the Greek crisis, but less willingness to provide that support and less willingness to pay, less leadership than we saw back then. Now, the broader crisis of regime implosion, I mean, of course, it's the developing world, it's the emerging markets that are really going to take it on the chin. They can't do the social distancing if you've got people living in slums and don't have the personal space. The governance is weaker, the health care is weaker. And here, what you'd really want to focus on are the places that have big middle classes with lots of demands, lots of expectations that just aren't going to get met, not domestically and not internationally. So I would say, you know, the Brazils out there, the Indias out there, the countries that we really thought had significant opportunity to grow, Turkey, and suddenly this year is going to hit them really hard. Their middle classes are going to be really angry, and their governments are going to be pretty incapable. Where at least in the United States, there's a lot of division in the United States, but we're not starving. And, we're getting bored, we're pulling our hair out, we're not getting haircuts. But we're not going to die. I mean, unless the coronavirus actually, affects us. The economic side is a much more immediate problem for so many of the developing countries around the world.
And yet here, even in the United States, we continue to see the escalation of these culture wars and President Trump now going on the offense, given that, let's not forget, it's an election year, right? So when we're seeing more attacks towards multilateral organizations, whether it's the WHO, the WTO, not to mention keeping up the pressure on China, how much more risk could we see this year?
There's a big risk. We're going to see more decoupling of the U.S. and the Chinese economy. That was happening before coronavirus in the technology space. Google, Amazon couldn't get into China. We weren't letting Huawei, ZTE in the United States, telling our allies not to use them. Now that's going to include more manufacturing and services, especially, of course, when it comes to medical supplies and personal protective equipment, but more broadly than that. And if the two sides don't need each other, there's not interdependence, the potential of a fight escalating is a lot greater. Trump's been reluctant to beat up on Xi Jinping personally, even in the last few weeks, in part because he kind of knows that he wants some kind of stability in the China relationship. He doesn't want to escalate tariffs on consumer goods that will hurt the average American voter in an election year. But definitely his going after the World Health Organization is a way for him to push blame away for the Trump administration that was awfully late in responding to this coronavirus crisis compared to other countries that also were lied to by the Chinese, like the South Koreans or the Germans or the Canadians. And, you know, in an election year, Trump never wants to take responsibility for anything, but particularly right now, China's looking like a really juicy target. They did, after all, cover up this entire pandemic for the first month while millions of Chinese were traveling.